But we were lucky because we just had the idea to record, like 2 people would record, but I forgot, but thankfully my colleague did
Okay,
not.
it's
So
great
I
that
was,
other people recorded. Okay, I'm recording. So, okay, for start, can you just briefly introduce yourself and tell us where you're from and what you do? Just shortly.
okay. So my name is Ozgun. I'm from Turkey and I'm a journalist, let's say, based in Istanbul. I've worked for several newspapers, Taraf Hürriyet News and Bir Gün. Then I also worked for NGOs. I worked for UNICEF, for Amnesty Turkey. And now for more than a couple of years, I've been working with an association called Platform for Independent Journalism, which is based in Istanbul and which carries out projects to report on the situation about press freedom in Turkey, which means following trials, following the cases, and doing a thorough reporting job out of it. We also carry another project on censorship. And on the other side of the coin, we also carry out cultural projects. We have a website, I think the country's most followed website on literature. And we have founded what is called the Istanbul Literature House, which is a place where in our mind is like reporting would be like a work of preventing or documenting about what violations, and the literature house on the other side, it's a space that allows people to exert their right of free speech, but it also allows to exert the have a debate not directly on political topics but around it through literature, through arts, and through culture. And personally, I also pitched some stories to Index on Censorship and on the website.
Great, thanks. Okay, so the next question, in your opinion, can independent journalism contribute to spreading solidarity among people with similar views and with different worldviews?
If we define independent journalism with by saying that the journalism that is not corporate, that is not financed, but by big corporations, I think yes. But in Turkey, we have seen, like in Turkey, there was no independent journalism. There's still almost not independent journalism. All the mainstream newspapers were sort of tied with big corporations, and from 2000 onwards, like prior to 2000, they were like tied with the old establishment, and after the 2010, the current government start to find their way through businessmen close to them buying these corporations, and now the entire mainstream is almost owned by businessmen close to the government, and they have this pro-government coverage of events. Well, there was almost no freelancing in Turkey. So what's interesting is with the crackdown on media, what appeared is what had to exist and didn't exist, which means there are a lot of colleagues now who freelance for new online outlets who are more or less independent, we should say, get some money from funding, get some money, well, through solidarity, etc. But also, they can work if they have a foreign language. They also can work for this foreign news outlets, and there are like a handful of foreign outlets who have their own Turkish, let's say, not channels, not websites, but they also publish in like BBC. BBC has BBC in Turkish, which is an institution. Deutsche Welle has Deutsche Welle, and there are people who are working with them. So it has somehow in the middle of crackdown, it has somehow created a place where there is kind of a good journalism. I say kind of because there's not much financial means, but there are like some good practices over there. So yeah. So I think independent journalism is key if you don't want to, and good reporting, I think, is key if you want to have a scrutiny uh, against the government. And prior to this period, even in the mainstream, you would find what were called good reporters, but they weren't reporting in a very uh, I mean, they were just covering things. They weren't reporting, and that was, I think, one of the reasons why the mainstream journalism has become toothless, because they didn't have a real scrutiny of the government. I
It
guess
seems
I
that
can talk half an hour about this. So I'm just
I know it
yeah.
seems that the journalism is really, really degraded in every country, not just in Croatia. The next question. You are also one of the founders of Kira Tani. Did I read it correctly? The
Yeah,
literature house. So
yeah, Kratane. Yeah. Hmm.
it seems like it's a kind of space that actually promotes the ideas that are emphasized on the project. So, did the
Hmm.
experience that you have from there help you contribute to your group's work a couple of weeks ago?
Yeah, totally. I mean, this is interesting because I think um, it's funny. We as journalists, we just stepped in this area where journalists don't go, and we have a very different approach, I guess, than cultural workers, which is sometimes good, sometimes bad. But first of all, I have to say it has contributed because it's a physical space, and it's a space where we really have a perspective on rights. So we didn't open this space just to have nice events, and just people could come in and have it and spend a nice time, and then get a beer in the bar next door. No, no. The idea was also to have a space where people talk about issues that weren't talked about, and we have. I mean, the main focus is on literature, but the funny thing is, literature in Turkey has always been political until especially the 1980s, and it's a great way to talk about other things surrounding society. For example, through literature, you can talk about the Armenian genocide, which is what we did. Through literature, you can talk about the Kurdish minority, which is what we did. Through literature, you can also talk about the situation of women and women writers and gender equality. We have had several events on that. And of course, there is the space. Queer literature is inexistent, but you can talk about queer studies, and we had this kind of events. And the nice thing about, I guess, what most surprised us is also uh, we we didn't have this clear political, not political, polarized tone. For example, in Turkey, when you're a socialist, there are like a lot of socialist parties. They never can get together and have a big socialist party. So it's just like in the 70s, fractions, fractions, fractions. And each fractions have their own space, but these fractions have their language is so politically charged that you won't get any sort of like conservative young student going to their events. And here we were surprised because we were seeing like whales, like wearing the whale, young students coming to an event on queer, and we were like, wow. I mean, this is, I think, something which is needed in society. It's like different people going to learn about their own differences, but just learn and listen and maybe question themselves about it or not, or but appreciate that there are differences. and I think it's important. One more thing, this is something very important. It's not your question, but it's just to fit in. Maybe it will be an interesting detail. In Turkey, one of the biggest problems, it's also linked to journalism, is that all the major cultural spaces are financed by big corporations.
Mm-hmm.
Like the biggest one is Istanbul Modern, which was opened ahead of uh, the time when Istanbul was the cultural capital of Europe in early 2000s, I guess. Uh, there's huge corporations behind it, the Istanbul Culture and Arts Foundation, big corporations behind it. And like uh, a bank called Akbank has its own space. Pipe company has a magnificent space of art, but they're a pipe company, for God's sake. And the problem is there is no public funding here for culture. So either you have these big corporations who like to give a lot of money for big flashy things, but you also want to have your modest space doing your modest stuff, but good stuff. And for this, there's a lot of I think trouble to finance all these things, and God knows we're lucky because we can we're in Istanbul, so we have this network and we can apply for funding, etc., etc. In other cities, it's more complicated, and in this way, I think it's important that places like Kıraathane and other places can survive.
That is what connects to the next question, actually. It is, do you think that the concept of literature house is something that could or should be spread to places where the freedom of speech or expression is limited?
Yes, it's funny because the concept, I think, one of our founders is Norway, and the concept was coined in Norway. So they're for them it's like their own soft power. It's like literature huset. They all have this huset things. I mean, they put uh, culture houses, culture huset, etc., etc. So for it comes from a country, very wealthy country,
Yeah.
and at the forefront of human rights. But what allows, I think, the literature is something very important. For example, uh, I think this is a good example. Uh, we inspired, well, they're sort of friends as well, publishers, friends. Another literature house in Diyarbakir, which is the biggest Kurdish city in Turkey. And the second Diyarbakir was opened in Turkish Kurdistan, which is uh, and not in Ankara, not in Izmir, not in other big city, but in Diyarbakir. And it's an important detail because um, they need, for example, for them, language is very important. Their language has been for years um, uh, under the pressure of the Turkish establishment, the Turkish government, and still they cannot, they can talk it easier now, but uh, there are still problems, especially when tensions rise. You know, there are more restrictions. And the interesting fact about the Kurdish spoken in Turkey, which is a different dialect, the Kurdish spoken in Iraq, that's Sorani. In Turkey, they talk Kurmanchi. And Kurmanchi, the language hasn't yet uh, been set. Like Kurdish writers cannot write in their own language. They can speak, they cannot write, which is very sad, actually.
Yeah.
Um, there's one famous Kurdish poet who is very famous in Europe, Bejan Matu, who said like she started to write in Kurdish, and like her poems were like a children's poem when she wrote, and her mother, who doesn't know Turkish, became her editor. Like she said, my mother never understood my poems, and now she's my editor, which was very, very beautiful. So what's interesting with this literature house, it will be a space where they could build the foundations of the language as well, and that's very significant, I think.
Yeah.
uh, they need their own, because even their dictionary has been translated from the Turkish dictionary into their own dialect, which is nonsense. They have to invent their own dictionary. So this is a good example, and yeah, it can be a good model. It can be it's also a good place to not to frontally discuss stuff that polarize people, but get around it a little bit.
To get together, exactly.
Yeah, as well.
And language is actually always a really, really important tool for identifying with yourself and with the people who are close to you,
Yeah,
actually with
definitely.
defining yourself. So the next question is, what are the challenges that you face while you carry out the project of Literature House? What are some challenges that you face? Did you have some problems with the local government or?
So far we didn't have any problem with the authority. Well, sometimes we joke around. We say, well, is there plainclothes pollution among the crowd, or not? But so far we didn't have any problem. Although we did things like we hosted twice an exhibition, a very local queer exhibition during Pride. Two prior years, with like last year's opening was crazy. There was a huge party, and they did a huge party, but it was okay. We were just scared because we just, stuff happened in Turkey, but thankfully nothing happened. So we didn't really have this kind of troubles. I think the biggest problem is still financial because, we have a building in the center of the city, costly. Um, all the operations cost a little, so we have to apply to funding. So we get like free funding for funding, but like some fundings are just for 4 months, others are all year round. None have budget for personnel. So I think it would be very difficult if we didn't have other activities like uh, uh, with the association about journalism, and like, you're earning your life, your bread there, and draining some energy to do this events. So it's not really um, I'm not sure it will be very, very easy to implement if you want to do this and really modestly earn your life and pay your expenses. It's not easy to find the money in a country like Turkey where there is no subsidies for that.
Do you think that if you did something else, like having poetry nights about love for the country, maybe if you then had like uh, maybe do you think that you would find yourself more easily in that way, like if your subject was different from what you do now?
That's definitely because in Turkey there is a problem involved with publishing as well. It's so um, the books are so cheap because people don't give higher more money to books, but at the same time, uh, it's the margin of profit is very, very low. Distribution is exploiting all the publishers anyway. It's an horrible situation. So it's not like publishers have a lot of money that can support a place like this. So there is a problem involved with the economy of publishing in Turkey, economy of media as well, because there's not much money involved. But I think what's also needed to be said is that again, it's the same thing for public institutions. But now with the AKP, you can't say anything because AKP has been for a few years in Istanbul. Obviously, they have funded religious foundations close to them rather than cultural
Yeah.
institutions, etc. But what's really silly is with these big corporations, because big corporations, when they give money, they want something very, very they want to show off. Istanbul, there is one biennial. It's the biennial of contemporary arts. It's every 2 years, and it's financed by one of the biggest, like one of the two biggest holdings, trusts in Turkey, which is Koç Holding. And the money that they spend, it's enormous. Like for one event or two events, you can just finance a space like this for a year. I mean, it's crazy money. But it's this point of view. It's like when there is like a private company that comes in, what they want is to do something to show off their power, and you never get what's necessary for more modest size cultural project, which is sad. I mean, I'm not only speaking for us, I'm also speaking for independent theaters who may close after the pandemic, for example. I mean, there's a huge debate about this. Recently, the Istanbul municipality has bought a portrait of the Sultan Mehmet the Conqueror, drawn by the famous Italian painter Gentile Bellini of his time, which is very famous, no doubt about that. They give like almost £1 million for that, and people were criticizing because if it's the same thing in your country, probably what you were mentioning. I mean, it's that £1 million you would distribute it to the theaters. I mean, perhaps some of them wouldn't close. So, or you have done well, then give £1 million to those theaters as well. So, yeah. So they like PR. And PR usually doesn't correspond, doesn't match with effective cultural activities.
Yeah. That's what happened here during the lockdown. Actually, if the culture workers didn't actually raise their voices and said, like, we are out of money, we can't support ourselves if we do not work, they won't even get anything because no one was even thinking about them, especially
Yeah,
independent
horrible.
artists and culture workers in general. It's like, it's terrible. Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
and it's when it's a matter of life and death, they think it's not a
yeah,
priority
yeah,
culture. So it's
exactly. We're moving on to the last question.
mm-hmm,
It is, what are your impressions on Culture Lab Europe in general? And do you think that
mm-hmm.
experience will contribute to your further work considering the literature house or your journalism? And what actually inspired you to join the project in the first place?
Okay. I mean, it's my first time being involved in such a project, and I know for sure that a lot of people who are in the circuit are more, actually, obviously, more used to this kind of work, and I'm not, and we're probably not yet. Well, it's very useful because I think we met a lot of partners around Europe. So meeting people, it's already something very interesting for us, especially for a country who lives in its own bubble. I mean, Turkey is really a bubble. It's like sometimes you forget there's the place like called Earth or the universe. Anyway, um, so meeting was very nice, and uh, learning and meeting was, I think, the first thing that we gained. Then doing things together would be very, very nice. Just we in the future, what we would like to do is to open our spaces for people from abroad, from outside, and so all having this network of communication for us is really precious, and it's also precious to our group was nice because there was one person from Tate, another from Reina Sofia, and to kind of more, let's say, not individual, but almost individual, like presenting some collectives or some more like loose form of doing art. So it was a good mix, and uh, I don't know what will come out of it. I have no idea, but um, we'll be very interested in I think in doing something together, whatever it is, doing something different and doing something that is that may have an impact, and although in a modest size, and in Turkey, I mean, and it was like one of the participants was from Moldova, and I think Eastern Europe is a very interesting geography because
Mhm.
some of the problems are similar, but on the other side, there is a lot of knowledge about culture. I mean, there is a lot. It's the I always feel that the tradition of culture doing culture works is much wider than Turkey. So their perspectives also very interesting usually. And yeah,
One
no, it was all fine.
question. Um, is it, do you think that it's actually, uh, is it important for you to connect from people from all over Europe, Eastern, Western, and Turkey,
Yeah, definitely. I mean, yeah, yeah.
experience and knowledge?
hmm No, definitely. It's as I said. I mean, it's uh, we have to go outside this bubble. I mean, the worst type of thing is just talk and talk and talk and talk about the situation in your country. But sometimes it's nice to cut this bubble, but not talking through uh I don't know. I mean, let's say it's Romania, you're just gonna talk about Paul Celan's life and how he escaped, etc. But no, having people with their flesh and bones in front of you, and see what they're currently actually doing, and yeah, and uh, having them, and giving them your space. I don't know if they're artists, giving them your space to show their art or their performances, or if they're a writer, to invite them. We have a writer's residence, by the way. So we're writer or artist in residence. So anyone who comes to Istanbul can stay in our house. There's a room for that. Yeah, that because the Norwegian invented that, so we copied. But yeah, so yeah, so this is why it's very interesting. So we have a space, so we will really like to have this exchange, really. Yes.
It is really great, but the thing that was different from other conferences is that it was a digital conference. So the
Yeah.
experience was a bit different than usual. So what are your thoughts about that, about having a digital space for something like this?
Well, it has it's more difficult digitally because that was one of the questions in my mind is like, in a country like this, like Turkey, we're gonna go digital from September on. But in a country like Turkey, people to conquer, to go beyond their differences, they have to share a room together, in a way, share a space together. I mean, it's there. I don't know if it can work digitally. I'm not sure. Maybe it can, but it just being physically together with your differences is still very important. Uh, so uh, doing digital events can be interesting, but it will have, I think, its limits. And meeting digitally with others. I mean, we talked among us. I mean, there were two, I think, back two issues with that. Um, one of which is that, you know, because we all have lots of things to do, we couldn't focus 100% to the meetings. Like, you know, we had all our jobs, and the meetings where we just squeeze the meeting is inside the other job. Whereas if we met somewhere else, we would be, you know, all our focus would be on what we were doing. So that was one of the drawbacks, I guess. And the second one is to usually what usually more what contributes more to all this is the little talks you have in the breaks and all this kind of thing. So we couldn't have that either, really. So yeah, so that were the two issues, but nevertheless it's better than nothing. I mean, it's nice to see other faces when especially you're in lockdown. We're not anymore, but yeah, the beginning we were. So yeah, that was nice anyway.
So you don't think that's the future, which I agree to.
I think the future will be more hybrid. I mean, people have get used to this Zoom meetings and this Zoom conferences, but again, in the country of Turkey, it's like Turkey. It's still the. I mean, maybe it's the same thing in the Balkans. You might understand. I don't know. I can't say, but it's so polarized. Like bringing together someone from the left wing, someone's a nationalist, a Kurd, and sharing a space together is still more important than having your head on the screen. You know, they have to confront each other, but in a good way. And this is, I'm not sure other than physically if it's possible. But we'll see. I mean, it's a challenge we will all have for the coming not only months, I think, but a couple of years, I guess.
We'll see.
We'll see.
So
Yeah.
thank you very much. That's about it. And
Thank you.
thank you for having some time for us and for the
Mm,
great answers that you had.
no worries. I hope it's been useful for you, and thanks
Yeah,
for
very,
the.
very useful. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And um, okay. I mean, you can email me whenever you want.